I gotta talk to you guys about MERS. This story kind of blew me away. I follow a lot of Russian military Telegram accounts and different like Russian sources, and I don't do it because I, particularly like any of the people or whatever. I do it because I want to diversify the information that I take in about the war. And if I just consume either Western sources or Ukrainian sources, I feel like I'm gonna get a very biased perspective of the war. Not when it comes to like the ideology, even though of course I'll listen to their ideological mumble jumble as well. But when it comes to, death statistics, loss statistics, how battles are going, etc. You don't ever take any of these sources completely at face value. Some of them are more credible than others. I would say that, a news publication that's been published for over 100 years, has multiple processes of vetting, has a somewhat decent reputation, would probably be a lot more credible than, say, random Telegram account not on the ground connected to state media apparatus. But it's still a useful source because I like listening to the Russian milbloggers because they tend to give you a better perspective since they're on the ground more often than not, and they have sources on the ground, and they loosen their lips a lot more than Russian state media does. And so I listen to them and I hear about, oh, this offensive failed because of this reason, or this commander's bad, and it gives me a decent enough perspective. Now, if you just watch these things in isolation, you'd get a crooked view of the war. So if you do consume this media, all I will recommend for you guys is, of course, diversify your information intake. Don't let the algorithm dominate your information intake. Don't let any government dominate your information intake, and don't let any special interest group dominate your information intake. Anyway, so MERS, who is the Russian milblogger in question we're about to talk about, was one of the military bloggers that I would read on occasion. And he's somebody that has been engaged in the Russian invasion of Ukraine since 2014. He has been fighting in Ukraine back since 2014 for 8 years, up until the 2022 invasion. He was fighting in and out, in and off and on, off and on. And then after that, he got back engaged, doing a lot of, military blocking. As you can see, the man has aged a little bit as the war has gone on. 10 years of conflict will do that for a man, But I would say that MERS is one of the few people that I can truly say I think is a quote unquote true believer. And what I mean by that is, this is somebody that I think genuinely wants to win because he wants to take the land of Ukraine back for Russia, because he believes that it belongs to Russia. That's why, from his perspective, it would be taking it back for Russia. He believes in the struggle, but in difference to a lot of the commanders, he also has been one of the soldiers fighting in this war for a very long time, has a lot of ties into the occupation and the people who are engaged in the occupation, and has probably, to some extent, like many soldiers, built a certain level of comradeship with the other people in service. So when the Battle of Avdiivka happened and the death numbers started to come in, the Russians were celebrating it. And if you checked out either Steve Rosenberg's reporting on the Russian press inside, on the Russian magazines and the Russian newspapers covering the capture of Avdiivka, I mean, it was page after page after page highlighting that they captured it with the Russian soldiers standing triumphantly over the rubble with the flag in hand, looking proud. As those pictures were circulating, MERS stumbled upon some data on the death count. Now, mind you, this is older data. Since then, more people have died. Since then, more assaults have been done on the villages around Avdiivka, leading to more deaths, and more people have died while within the hospital system. Now, according to MERS, the attack to take Avdiivka produced 16,000 dead and 300 destroyed vehicles. Mind you, let me say that again. 16,000 dead, not casualties, not injured, not, people who, just got hurt here a little bit. Those are the dead. So on top of the dead, there are also injured personnel. So we're talking people who have lost their leg, people who have lost their arm, people who have lost their hand, people who are blind, shrapnel injuries in the back, broke their spine. So this is the dead, not the casualties. If you believe Ukrainian numbers, and I need to say that this is from the Ukrainian government.
Tier 1 subscriptions.
Back to the Ukrainian numbers. The Ukrainians, for whatever you think of the Ukrainian statistics, I think Perun, who's a YouTuber, did a very good video breaking down the differences in the data of casualties between the different sources, and that the Ukrainian armed forces does seem to have, with their statistics, it's tied to reality. As in, not necessarily that every single number they put out is, you know, true, but that their numbers increase and decrease relative to the IRL destruction on the battlefield. So wherever the casualty is, this is how I calculate it. If you want an idea for how I try to figure out where the casualty number is, it's whatever we can get from OSCENT and somewhere between what the Ukrainians publish. I think it's somewhere, some median in between. Exactly where, I cannot tell you. I don't have the data for that, but that's how I try to personally publish it. Because I want to know, like, this is what I can see, so this is what I know is true. But obviously, not every single destruction is recorded. So I think calculating that tied to those numbers allows me to figure out a range that is at least believable. But bringing us back to this, whether it's 16,000 dead, whether it's increased a little bit, added another 1,000 dead there, another 1,000 dead there, the 47,000 casualties, whether that number is reflective of reality or it's somewhere lower, like 30,000, 35,000. Point is, if we just stick to the 16,000 dead, which the Russian milblogger reported, that is more death than 10 years of fighting for the Russians in Afghanistan. One Donbass town, and this is from MERS. This is what MERS said. Well, actually, no, I think it's from another Russian milblogger. In one Donbass town, the Russians lost more soldiers than in 10 years of fighting in Afghanistan. Let me say that again. In one Donbass town, the Russians lost more men than in 10 years of fighting in Afghanistan. That is horrific. That is hard to contemplate, that level of death and destruction. And we're just talking about the dead. We're not talking about the injured. And when we're talking about the loss of equipment, when you want to figure out how are the Russians going to replenish stuff, you can always say, well, the Russians have more people. But the loss of equipment is devastating. According to the Ukrainian statistics, and of course, like I said, don't just take the Ukrainian statistics at their word. They're saying around 360 tanks since they started their offensive against Avdiivka in October. And we don't know if this pro-Russian war blogger is saying this is all of the attacks of Avdiivka since the start of the war, back since October. We don't know. But the Ukrainians are saying over 300 tanks lost, hundreds and hundreds of trucks lost, hundreds of IFVs, infantry fighting vehicles, of APCs, armored personnel carriers, and also artillery batteries. I think at least over 100 or 200 artillery batteries. And a lot of this, by the way, if you don't believe the Russian statistics, I would just say go look at the OSCENT data. The OSCENT data alone paints a horrifically brutal picture for Russian equipment losses. So even if you were to say, well, the Russian recruiters are right now making 85% of their recruitment numbers, you could talk about the loss of experience. You could talk about like the morale loss on the Russian public, but the loss of equipment is not stuff that can be quickly replaced. You cannot lose 300 tanks or even half of that taking one town when you're producing, according to the Russians, 200 tanks a year and say this is a completely sustainable model of warfare perpetually into the future. Let's do this for every town going forward. And I think that's part of the reason why we're seeing a lot more of coordinated assaults around Kupiansk, maybe an attempt to break down the front. I think it might be part of the reason why the Russians are pressing so hard right now as the Ukrainians are running low on ammunition, hoping that the pressure can put an end to the bloodshed. But it's very likely, especially if Western support comes, and as the Czechs are trying to gather 800,000 shells to send over, the Europeans 1 million by year's end, the Americans trying to pass a $60 billion aid package, even though $20 billion is for their own refurbishment. There's a good chance that these assaults, this pressure building, might be met with gridlock and be stopped, and this bloodshed will continue. And so this is the picture that MERS is seeing. 16,000 dead, one Donbass town, more soldiers than they lost in 10 years in Afghanistan. Horrific. Largest war in Europe since World War II. So MERS doesn't like that. And MERS publishes this letter before killing himself. Full text of the letter the late MERS promised to publish before killing himself. The letter was authorized by a serviceman of the 1487 Regiment of the Russian Forces Armed Formation, Russian Federation Armed Formation, which took part in the Avdiivka battle. It lists the lack of weapons and transport provided, losses of 70% of the regiment, complete lack of medical examinations and treatment, and transfer to the Veterans PMC, which is connected to Putin himself. This PMC consists of criminals who did not show up on the front line, but claim the success of the regiment. The main component for MERS was that this 1487 regiment was not even mentioned in Putin's telegram listing units that took part in the occupation of Avdiivka. Here is his letter. To the chief military prosecutor of the Russian Federation, Petrov, an appeal. I, the applicant's full name can be viewed in the electronic copy of the document, serving as part of the mobilized regiment, mobilization in Regiment 1487, Field Post Unit 95411, in the 2nd Battalion of the 6th Company of the 1st Platoon of the City of Donetsk, under the command of the 1st Army Corps of the DPR Army, I ask you to conduct an inspection for the following reasons. Provisions of weapons and transport. From January 19th, 2023, from the moment we arrived in the SMO zone to the present day, our battalion does not have a single AGS or mortar to carry out effective offensive operations. There is also a complete lack of transport for offensive operations or evacuations and transportation of people. 2. Rotation. At the moment, less than 30% of the personnel in the regiment remain, and to this day there has been no rotation or replenishment of the regiment's personnel. Most are wounded, killed, or missing. 3. Medical assistance. Using my own example, I have shell shock. I turned to the chief medical officer of the regiment about my injury, to which the serviceman said that the shell shock is not considered a wound and did not put me on the list of wounded after completing the combat mission. So I went to the hospital on my own, and I was prescribed medications, which I purchased at my own expense and were administered to me by a battalion medic. When the time came, after treatment in the dugout, the chief medical officer of the regiment refused to provide a certification of injury, for which I turned to the local doctors and they gave it to me. At the moment, I receive a payment from the president of the Russian Federation and from the city of St. Petersburg, but I handled these payments myself, and the DPR Army servicemen helped me process the payments. They took me to hospitals and to obtain medicines. I, after being wounded, did not undergo medical examination, and I did not have rehabilitation, even a rest from service. There are a lot of such cases of injuries not registered by the commander of the regiment. Many servicemen were sent with concussion of shrapnel without examination and rehabilitation back into battle, where many died. 4. Transfer of the military regiment to other units. In November of 2023, the regiment's command transferred 300 people to the command of the Veterans PMC. At the moment, almost all of them are killed or wounded, and in all sectors of the Avdiivka front, we are commanded by the Veterans PMC. The message that they are in charge, comes from the command of the 1st Army Corps of the DPR Army, in particular, the call sign Kim, Crimea. These military personnel of the PMC veterans, I'm not afraid of this word, are a rabble of former prisoners, drug addicts, and looters, hiding behind the backs of our mobilized regiment, carrying out assault actions without being present on the ground. After we occupied the lines, they came, filmed a video report, took weapons, armor plates from the dead, everything valuable, both from the Russian army servicemen and from our enemies, and then went into the gray zone, leaving us on the line of contact. So there's a lot to unpack here, from the incredibly high casualty rates, 70% being dead or wounded, with only 30% of the regiment remaining, a horrible lack of mortars and supply equipment that they need, real divisions between, and this has been reported on for the better part of a year, real divisions between different parts of the Russian armed forces. Before, it was all talk about Wagner, Shoigu, Gerasimov, and the confrontation between different PMCs, but there are real real conflicts between PMC Convoy and the Gazprom PMC and this unit that is Putin's boys, you know, the presidential, what are they called again? I forget what they're called. The presidential, I think it says it, yeah, the veterans, where is it called? The veterans, whatever, the veterans unit, whatever, Putin's boys. There's the Chechens and other different military formations have had conflicts before, and it's gotten to the point where local volunteers had complained that the different units along the front line, one would be flanking the other, but they're not properly communicating, and one could be giving fire support to the other as they're attacked or they're on the attack, but they don't due to a lack of communication and friction between the units. Now, how much of that has been, you know, dealt with since the Wagner coup? How much of that still remains? I mean, at least this certainly shows that there are still conflicts between PMC veterans and other other units full of mobilized people or others who are genuinely out there on the front, dying, fighting, and being thrown into the meat grinder. This also shows a complete lack of, at least from his testimony, a complete lack of regard for serious medical issues like PTSD, shell shock, things that can be horrific for soldiers, horrific for servicemen trying to come back home. And if you're this guy and you're seeing these crazy casualty numbers come in, more dead than during the 10-year in Afghanistan, in one Donbass town, 16,000 dead on top of the wounded, on top of the loss of equipment, the number only expected to increase, not only as they uncover more death, but also as they keep up the assaults, as they're now engaged in more assaults on Kupiansk and Robatne. This is all while they're starved of equipment, go through extremely high casualties, and he has self-treated PTSD as the military ignores it, all while their military accomplishments, according to him, are claimed by others. After seeing so much horror, not being given any treatment to deal with the images he has seen and how it's affected his body, and how the war has affected his body and affected his mind, and being mistreated so much, before he released this, he was having Solenyev and others railing against him for publishing that 16,000. And so he finally comes out and at least utters the amount of death and destruction he sees that his own government won't give him the medicine to treat the effects of. And then he gets punished by Russian state TV talking heads who would never, ever get anywhere close to the front line. And then he releases this and kills himself. If you're a diehard believer in the Russian occupation of Ukraine, and you're putting yourself in harm's way to try to bring that about, there's a huge moral problem with that. Obviously, you taking part in the occupation of another state. But putting aside any of that, from the perspective of a diehard believer, it's not hard to imagine why he killed himself. I understand that some people are speculating, oh, maybe it was Putin. You know, people over there, they reportedly kill themselves quite a lot. But if you've got the state media apparatus coming for his ass after he releases the 16,000 dead, he is dealing with horrific images that he's seen, horrible mental problems. He's pissed. I can believe that he really did it. I'm not saying that I know he did it. I'm saying I can believe he did it from his perspective as a true believer in Russian Empire. But I think this also shows, because this guy had a lot of love in the Russian milblogger community, I think it shows exactly that the biggest supporters of the Russian Imperial Project who signed up for it and are the ones on the front line ready to give all for it are the ones paying the biggest price on the Russian side. And they're not given any appreciation for that fact, it seems.